This is going to come as a surprise to you. All right, are you ready? I hope you're sitting down while you're watching this. Here it is. I am not fast. Shocking, I know. I can hear your astonishment through the TV screen. I might look fast, but stunner, I'm actually quite slow. What if I challenge Nate to a race? You know Nate, he's the one that just did the announcements a few moments ago. He's spending several weeks with us this summer just kind of learning about ministry. Now, I don't know if you know this about Nate. He's a long-distance runner. He runs cross-country for the university where he attends. He's quite good at it. What if I challenge Nate to a race? Now, let's say that race was just 10 feet. That's like 3 large steps for me, maybe 4. Nate, let's race 10 feet. Now, I might have a chance at that because I could start strong, you know, and maybe he's just a little, I catch him off guard, he's a little slower at the start than me, and maybe I get a step on him, and I might, not likely, but might have a chance to beat him at a 10-foot race. What if I challenged him to a 1-mile race or a 3-mile race? Or Nate, he runs 8 miles most every day. What if he challenged me or I challenged him to an 8-mile race? How long would I be able to stay with him? You know, I might start strong. I might be able to keep his pace for 10 yards, 50 yards, maybe 100 yards. But I'll tell you, about right after that, boy, I am going to fade and fade quickly. You know, there's something about starting strong, but not finishing well. You ever experienced anything like that? What about when it comes to the Christian faith? Can you think of anybody? Have you ever met anybody? Maybe you know somebody, a family member, a friend, maybe even in your own life, where you felt like you started strong when it came to following Jesus. But then over time, and maybe you can't point to an exact moment where it happened for that person, but just over time you realized they're not finishing well. What's the danger of that? How do we keep from doing that and finishing this race that God has given to us? How do we finish it well? We're going to close out the story of Gideon in our time together today. This is the end of our 4-week series. If you've missed any of the first 3 weeks, I would encourage you, you can find those on YouTube and just see this narrative, see God's hand at work throughout the life of Gideon. Let me just briefly tell you where we're going to pick up the story. You remember last week, Gideon had finally had the big battle. Gideon, by the Spirit of the Lord, he and his 300 men, they have now defeated the Midianites. That's what happened last week. And the Midianites are now on the run. Gideon's given chase. The Midianite army started at 135,000 people. It's now been reduced to just 15,000. Meanwhile, all 300 of the Israelites remain, and they're chasing after them. And that brings us to chapter 8. Let me give you a little bit of a summary here. In the first 20 verses of chapter 8, Gideon faces a series of new challenges that revealed that victory on the battlefield didn't mean that the struggle was over. There's a tribe that confronts Gideon in anger because they weren't included in the initial attack. But when you watch Gideon's response, he responds with humility and graciousness, and he diffuses a situation that could have been quite bad. Meanwhile, Gideon and his 300 men, they're exhausted, right? They've been fighting, they're chasing, they pursue the remaining Midianite kings. It's 2 guys by the name of Zebah and Zalmunna. There are Israelite towns along the way that refuse to provide food because they feared the Midianites' retaliation if Gideon isn't successful. But Gideon still presses on. He's not getting much support from those surrounding towns. He's able to launch a surprise attack, and he defeats the remaining Midianite forces, and he captures both of the kings. And when Gideon returns back, he then confronts the kings about the murder of his brothers. And after learning that those 2 specific kings were responsible, he personally executes them. And in these first 20 verses, the chapter highlights Gideon's perseverance and God's complete victory over Midian. But it also begins to reveal something else. It begins to reveal a subtle shift in Gideon's heart. As you read through this chapter, his actions become increasingly personal, maybe hinting at the dangers of pride and vengeance, self-reliance, that become even more evident in the remainder of the chapter. I'm going to pick it up in chapter 8, verse 22. The Midianites have been defeated, the last two kings have been killed, and it's time now to start a new chapter. So here's what happens in verse 22. Then the Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you as well as your sons and your grandsons, for you delivered us from the power of Midian." But Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." The Israelites want Gideon to set up some sort of dynasty here, right? They say you, your sons, your grandsons, some sort of dynasty is what they want to establish. And they give the reason why, right? Gideon, you saved us from the Midianites. You have brought the 7 years of unimaginable hardship and suffering to an end. They want the king slayer to become king himself. And at first glance, Gideon responds in the right way. He says, "I won't rule over you. My family won't rule over you," right? That's not how they do things. He says, "Instead, the Lord will rule over you." But there's two things that happen here that kind of make you just kind of squint and turn your head and say, something doesn't seem right here. Is there something that's starting to go on in Gideon's heart? Here's the first thing that stands out. Gideon doesn't correct them. Did you notice that? Yes, he tells them that it is God who will rule, but he doesn't say, wait a second, it was God who delivered us. It wasn't me. Right? He just lets them say, "Gideon, you delivered us," and he lets that go uncorrected. He doesn't say, don't you remember the odds that we faced and how God delivered in a way that only He can? It's hard to know exactly what's going on in Gideon's heart in this moment, but this exchange, at the very least, from the Israelites' perspective, and quite possibly it includes Gideon's as well, it lines up directly with what God predicted would happen. Last chapter, chapter 7, verse 2, right? When we read, the Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many troops for me to hand the Midianites over to them, or else Israel might elevate themselves over me and say, 'I saved myself.'" That seems to be what's happening here. So that's one thing that seems to signal that something might be amiss in Gideon's heart. What happens next is the second thing that makes you go, what's happening here? And that is Gideon's request. Let me keep reading, verse 24. Then he said to them, let me make a request of you. Everyone give me an earring from his plunder. Now the enemy had gold earrings because they were Ishmaelites. They said, "We agree to give them." So they spread out a cloak, and everyone threw an earring from his plunder on it. The weight of the gold earrings he requested was 43 pounds of gold, in addition to the crescent ornaments and ear pendants, the purple garments on the kings of Midian, and the chains on the necks of their camels. So even though Gideon said he wouldn't be their king, he does exactly what a king would do. Right? He takes a share of the plunder. He asks them for what I call a Gideon tax. You ever heard of like a daddy tax? I did this with my kids when they were younger. Like maybe they'd all get ice cream cones or something, and you'd come along and you'd say, time for the daddy tax, and I'd take a little bit of each of their ice cream cones. I always found that funnier than my kids did. I can't get away with that anymore, but that's what I used to do. That's kind of what's happening here. Gideon's like, it's time for a Gideon tax. Give me some of your gold. So that's what they do. And the weight of the gold earrings, it says, is 43 pounds. Now, in today's dollars, 43 pounds of gold would be roughly $1.5 million. Back then, gold was much rarer, and it was far more valuable than it is even today. 43 pounds of gold would have been the kind of wealth that you only associated with kings and rulers. I mean, this was serious wealth. What does Gideon do with it? Verse 27, Gideon made an ephod from all this, and he put it in Ophrah, his hometown. Then all Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his household. Now, first things first, what's an ephod? So normally an ephod, that's an apron-like garment worn by the high priest. It's made up of colorful threads and fine linen. And in this particular passage, there's a little debate as to what it really was. Well, first because of its weight, right? Like 43 pounds, that would be a really heavy apron. And a gold thing wouldn't be very flexible like an apron would be. Second, it seems to be more of an object that was designed to see. I mean, because it says that the ephod was put in, or it was placed in a town called Ophrah. In the right context, this word can also represent not only the costly garments, but a sacred image, right? Like a sacred image that it clothed. Maybe Gideon made some sort of representation of an ephod that was then more designed to be a sacred image, or an idol. Because whatever it was exactly, the important thing is that it was some sort of object that Israel began to worship. So much so that the author uses the strong language that Israel prostituted themselves. That is, they were unfaithful in their covenant with God. I mean, this is religious disloyalty in the highest order. One commentator put it like this: this metaphor carries profound theological weight because it emphasizes not merely the sin of worshiping other gods, but the relational rupture involved. Israel was God's chosen nation, bound to him by covenant, yet they repeatedly chose competing allegiances. The language of prostitution captures both the intimacy that had been violated and the shame of that violation. Then what's interesting is that the object and this whole process, it says, became a snare to Gideon and his family. They too were seduced by it. And if you think history is repeating itself, well, you would be correct. You remember the golden calf back in Exodus, where Moses comes down off the mountain to find the Israelites worshiping a golden calf? Do you remember how they made it? Let's rewind back to Exodus chapter 32, verse 2. Aaron replied to them, "Take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the gold rings that were on their ears, and they brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from them, fashioned it with an engraving tool, and made it into an image of a calf. Does that sound familiar? You know, the decision here by Gideon, it had lasting impact. It had consequences. The text says that it became a snare to Gideon and his family. It was a trap. The only other time this word appears in the book of Judges is earlier in chapter 2, when it says that the false gods will be a trap to Israelites. And this object that Gideon created, it represented power. It represented kingship. It was the very thing that Gideon claimed to be rejecting. Yet his actions here, they're speaking louder than his words. In fact, there's one more thing that kind of makes you squint and scratch your head a little bit. A few verses later, in verse 30, it reads this: Gideon had 70 sons, his own offspring, since he had many wives. His concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, and he named him Abimelech. Then Gideon, son of Joash, died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abiezrite. To have 70 sons with many wives. You know who else did that? Kings did that. And then, as if all of that wasn't enough, he had a concubine. That's someone with whom he had a relationship with, but wasn't on the same level as his primary wives. And this concubine gave birth to a son, who he named Abimelech. Now, often, if not most all of the time, names in the Bible have meaning. What does Abimelech mean? My father is king. So even though he seems to officially decline being king, his actions, as well, there's a couple of other things that I just haven't taken time to mention, they seemed to prove otherwise. Taking the kingship was not something God had told Gideon to do. This wasn't Gideon's to take. He was stepping outside of the assignment that God had given him. Which brings us to the sad conclusion of Gideon's story. Verse 33. When Gideon died, the Israelites turned and prostituted themselves. There's that phrase again. By worshiping the Baals and made Baal-berith their god. The Israelites did not remember the Lord their God who had rescued them from the hand of the enemies around them. They did not show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, for all the good he had done for Israel. Now if you keep reading in Judges chapter 9, you'll see that Abimelech, the one that's named My Father is King, he's not a good guy. You would read that he goes on to murder his 70 brothers. He actually does become king for a short while. He was vengeful, he was violent, he was ruthlessly self-centered. And with that, we've now come full circle. Right? We're back where we started. Do you remember what got Israel in this mess with the Midianites in the first place? Their worship of Baal and the false gods. Now they're right back there again. And what's more, don't miss where Gideon set up his ephod. It says it was in the town of Ophrah, his town. That is what started them on this downward trajectory. And if you keep reading the book of Judges, it does go downward. But if the town of Ophrah seems familiar, we've visited it before. That's where we first found Gideon. Right way back in Judges chapter 6, it says, the angel of the Lord came, and he sat under the oak that was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite. His son Gideon was threshing wheat in the winepress. We've been in Ophrah before. And there in Ophrah, Gideon tore down the altars of the false gods. That's what started all of this, only to eventually replace those altars with one of his own. Now, I don't know about you, but the way this story ends, it just feels disorienting, right? For the first 3 weeks of this sermon series, we've been like cheering him on, like, come on, Gideon, you can do it, keep going, have faith. But then we read how it ends, and maybe you're thinking, like, well, who really was Gideon? Right? Like what had he become? Was any of it real? What do we do with all that? Well, let me give you 2 dangers, I think, that come out of this passage that we need to be aware of. Here's danger number 1, idolizing leaders. The ending of Gideon's story is a warning against idolizing leaders. Certainly, there is good to be found in his story. There is inspiration there. That's kind of the point of Hebrews chapter 11, the Hall of Faith. We've referenced that, I think, each of the first 3 weeks. Right, where Gideon himself is mentioned for the things he did in this first part of the story. And be inspired by the spiritual leaders who had faith. Be inspired, but don't idolize. Don't give someone a place in your heart or mind that belongs to God alone. We all have people that we admire, that we look up to, that we have learned from. But all of them will cross a line at times that they shouldn't. Maybe even permanently. And if we've idolized them, that is, if we've put our faith in them more than God, if we've allowed ourselves to believe that they're infallible, that they can do no wrong, then when they do wrong, if we've put our trust in them, they're going to take us with them. Some years ago, there was a pastor that I had interacted with a few times, a pastor of quite a large church. And several different times I went and sat under his ministry and learned from him. And there was a lot of good things that he would present. And there's a sense where I did not idolize, but I did look up to him. I respected him and the ministry that God had given to him. Only to find out several years later that at that same time when I'm going and sitting under his ministry, he is doing things in his private life. He's making decisions. He's crossing lines that should never be crossed. And when I heard that news, it's a little disorienting. What do I do with all of that stuff that I heard from him? So what do we do instead? Let me go back to the Hall of Faith chapter, right? Because Hebrews 11 is about getting inspiration from these people that have gone before us. But really, the point of Hebrews chapter 11, where it finds its climax, is in chapter 12. Here's what it says in verse 1. Therefore, since we also have such a large cloud of witnesses surrounding us, that's the hall of faith, let us lay aside every hindrance and the sin that so easily ensnares us. Let us run with endurance the race that lies before us. Here it is, keeping our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy that lay before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Be inspired by Gideon's faith in the first part of his story, but idolize Jesus in all of his. Jesus not only started well, he finished well. He finished perfectly. And the author of Hebrews is reminding us of all of these faith stories and then says, but as you're running, don't look at them, look at Jesus. Gideon started humble, but he ended by acting like a king. Jesus started as a king, but he humbled himself. Gideon grasped for the rewards of a king, and Jesus laid them aside. Gideon had a sea of wives and sons. Jesus sacrificed his life for his bride. Jesus is the example. So don't idolize your leaders. Idolize Jesus. But the second danger that we've got to be careful of is idolizing yourself. Right? Something we need to talk about. And now immediately when I say don't idolize yourself, some, if not most of you, are going to think, right, like there's no danger of that. I don't worship myself. Joel, I'll just skip this point and meet you at the next one. Well, hang on. Idolizing yourself, it could take on a lot of different forms. But at its root, I think it's this idea. To idolize yourself means to forget who God is and what he has done. Right? See verse 34? As it's concluding the story, the Israelites did not remember the Lord their God who had rescued them from the hand of the enemies around them. That is what the Israelites did. They forgot. They forgot God's grace. They stopped remembering the victories that they had been given, their dependence on God, their reliance on God. It was all forgotten. So, beloved, let me ask you this. Is there an area of your life where you've stopped remembering? You forgot. You've forgotten the grace that you've been given. You've forgotten the strength that carried you through. Is there something in your life where you've started taking credit for something that only God can do? Are there things in your life that used to be, God did that, but have slowly shifted into, I did that? Or let me say it this way. Are there things in your life that used to be testimonies, but now are trophies? In church, we've got a lot of miracles, a lot of things that have happened around us. The list is long. How many of them are we still giving glory to God for? This week, as you head out, don't forget the lessons from Gideon. Remember. Remember the God who calls you and gives you an assignment. Remember the God who goes with you, whose strength carries you, who is full of grace and patience in his dealings with you. Remember the God who alone deserves the praise and glory for what is accomplished. Remember the God who got you there.